Greetings, everyone. Oh, hello. Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much and welcome. Before I get started, I want to bring two people who are no longer with us into the room. And I know for sure that either one of them would have been either here on this panel or featured in the films as cultural critics or music historians. And that is the Honorable Greg Tate. And that is the Honorable Sasha Jenkins. Sasha Jenkins had a film that was featured here in 2021, which was called Bitchin', The Sound of Fury of Rick James. Complicated, complex figure, yes, and the film was amazingly gorgeous and done well, and Scene has a review of that film in their journal, and so I just wanted to just call their names because they are partly why I'm sitting here today, and they are a part of the Black music documentary canon. So let's shout them out. Just want to shout out to what they've given us and their legacy. So Sasha Jenkins and Greg Tate. So part of what we understand when we think about resistance sometimes, I think, with social movements, for example, is that we may think about place, like social movements in place, right? We might associate the civil rights movement with the South, or we might associate the Nation of Islam with Detroit, or the Black Panthers with Oakland. And I think the same is true for Black music. Detroit techno, Chicago house, South African jazz, Ghanaian high life, and the Philadelphia sound, right? So I just really want to bring Philly in the room just out of respect, and just kind of give a quick roll call of the people who are from Philly, who have shaped all of us collectively. So feel free to clap when you hear the names of people who are either from Philly or created and contributed to the great Philadelphia sound. First and foremost, Billie Holiday. The International Philly Sound with Gamble and Huff, who produced the OJs, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, the Delphonics, the Stylistics. There's also Frankie Beverly and Mays. There is also the great and honorable Phyllis Hyman. There is Patti LaBelle. We are talking about Questlove and the Roots and the Soulquarians. We're talking about Bilal. We are talking about Jasmine Sullivan, right? And so really, I am lucky to be on this stage in this city and being able to just kind of call their names. I am sitting on this panel with some heavyweights and from some folks who have shaped me as well, with their long histories of Black music documentary filmmaking. And so I would love to introduce them by having them talk about the projects that are currently featured. And I know that Joseph doesn't have a project now that's featured, but I would love for you to just talk about Summer of Soul, as well as your work on Sly. But so if you could just please introduce your films, and also tell us about the ways that your subjects embody resistance, including genre.
Sure. Hi, BlackStar. My name is Elegance, Bratton. The film that I have at the festival is called Move Your Body, The Birth of House. In the shadow of disco demolition, when 50,000 white Americans decided to buy a disco record, but really any Black music, and you brought it to Kaminsky Park, and it would give you a discount to watch the baseball game. And at the end of that game, they blew all those records up with an intention to destroy disco music forever. Little did those white people know that there was a Black usher working at the event by the name of Vince Lawrence, 14 years old, who was working that job to save up money to buy a synthesizer upon which he would record the first house song. So when you ask about resistance in my film, it really comes down to Vince Lawrence and the truth of it all, right? That if we hold on to our values, even in the face of virulent, violent white supremacy, we might just change the world and make it better.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stanley Nelson, and it's just so beautiful to be here and to look out and see so many beautiful people. And thank you for being beautiful and inspiring me. I've done three music films, or I use a lot of music in my film, but I've done three primary music films: Sweet Honey in the Rock, Raise Your Voice, Miles Davis, Birth of the Cool, and the film that's here, We Want the Funk. Um, if you haven't seen We Want the Funk, all I can tell you is see it. It's the happiest film you'll see this year, and the funkiest. Um, Thank you.
Hi, I'm Christine Turner, and I'm the director of Sun Ra Do the Impossible. We just had our Philadelphia premiere across the street, and to add to your list of Philadelphians, I want to include Sun Ra and Marshall Allen, who was Sun Ra's longest collaborator and joined us for the screening. When I think about your question in terms of resistance, the first thing that comes to mind for me in regards to Sun Ra is, the fact that he founded one of, not the very first, but an early artist-run music label, and that he put out, along with his partner, Alton Abraham, their own music. And he was doing this, around 1956. This is before Motown even. And it was a way to sustain the band, yes, but also a way to have, that kind of creative independence that he wanted to have, so that he could make the kind of music that he wanted to make, that very often was outside of the box and did not fit into any kind of commercial box. And so I think his Saturn Records, originally it was called L Saturn Research, certainly comes to mind when I think about some of the ways that his music resisted. And also, just by virtue of the fact that, he was doing it at a time that was pretty unprecedented, and that he had limited means and had to be very resourceful. The music itself took on a very lo-fi aesthetic, a very lo-fi quality to it, and that became a part of the sound. So there was no formula. It was not commercial. It was not slick. It was not intended to be. And, he broke every formula in that way.
My name is Joseph Patel. I am honored to be here at BlackStar, honored to be on this panel with these people who have inspired me in the work I do. I was a producer on Summer of Soul, producer on Sly Lives, both with Questlove. Yeah, I think just the act of documenting these stories is resistance, right? We see right now, how much effort and energy goes into suppressing these stories and this music and the just cultural existence. So I think anything that we do as filmmakers, as storytellers, anybody in this room, whatever way you can just preserve Black music, Black history, it's a constant fight. It ebbs and flows in its intensity, but it's constant. So, I feel a sense of duty in contributing to this canon. Summer of Soul was a story about forgotten Black history and how Black history is really American history. And to some extent, Sly's story as well. Certain musicians fall away under the weight of whiteness and their contributions to the culture overall. And so I think telling these stories and telling Sly's story in particular was really important. Yeah.
Incredible. Thank you. I think I'm just going to ask you all individually just questions that came up for me when watching your film, or just sort of knowing your body of work. And I want to start with you, Elegance, because I'm really curious about house music sort of not being included and discussed as a part of the overall Black music canon. You have so many jazz musicians who were just sort of dismissive of the use of synthesizers, and even though Sun Ra in your film is using synthesizers in the 1940s and throughout his career. But house music is also a really tender place because it represents so many people who were disappeared from dance floors from HIV/AIDS. So I'm curious about how you held that part of the story in the research, and just what came up for you when holding that really tender space.
Well, I think there's a saying about documentaries that when you go in to make them, like you know exactly what it is you want to make, and then you get to talking to people, and you're like, actually, I got it all wrong. I have to start all over now. And this is no different. Music, art in general can be messy. Art scenes can be messy. People have complicated relationships to each other. You spoke earlier about place, and I think to answer your question, we got to talk about Chicago. How Chicago, being a segregated city, if you are a black person, period, who wants to have a future outside of the limited possibilities that redlining and segregation meted out, then you had to have some form of white collaboration, and thus you're kind of opening yourself up to exploitation, and so it's already an environment within which people are primed to be kind of taken advantage of because they're being moved from the center of the conversation. And house music being black and queer, house music comes out of the warehouse. It comes out of, and house music, like even the idea of when a genre starts, house music is a culture before it's music, before it's something that you could buy, right? So in the 1970s, Frankie Knuckles was playing disco songs, and they were calling them house parties. And Vince Lawrence went to those parties as a kid, and Vince was not gay. He wasn't. And most of his friends who created these first house songs that you could buy on a record were not gay. So right away, when you talk about the erasure of HIV and AIDS, there's an erasure that's happening that transforms a cultural need into an object that people can buy. So it becomes kind of heavy, right? And then, the DJ as the star implies a certain level of anonymity. So, the kind of music industry up until house comes along is about, you're recording albums to go on a tour. You have these kind of outsized personalities at the front of it that people are identifying with and then buying into. And the house music DJ is a force of goodwill, of merriment, but not necessarily a star in the same way. So I think that kind of complicates its ability to exist alongside, its musical relatives like jazz and hip hop and funk and soul, because those genres are star driven, and house music is beat driven. And then lastly on that, coming out of the shadow of disco demolition, right, which is, disco sucks is kind of like the phrase that people all know that was affixed to disco. And you think about it, who else sucks? There's kind of like a foreshadowing of the homophobia, right? That HIV and AIDS would,
Yeah.
much like right now, MAGA has, the mask is off again, the intensity is back up, right? Back then, house music coming out of the shadow, disco demolition, it was trying to be able to hide in plain sight. Mm-hmm. So to a certain extent, it's the anonymity of the queer voice, is kind of implicit in how the genre is constructed. And the purpose of my film is just to say once and for all very clearly, this comes from black gay people, and to pontificate a bit while dancing about the possibilities that black queerness can free us all, that we can look to people in our community and not necessarily look at them as some sort of like malignant force, some representation of ungodliness, but rather as a source of strength and liberation, which is what we've always been and will remain.
That's that's an answer. That's gorgeous. Thank you. Mr. Nelson, there are a million documentaries on funk music. You know, BBC has done so many of them, but I find that the nuance that you bring to this film is incredible by including like David Bowie and Elton John as guests on Soul Train. You know, by talking about these diasporic connections between funk and Fela and soul Makossa, like just these really sort of, I feel like nuanced points that get missed in these more commercial documentaries. I am curious about what you learned about funk in this process.
I think that you know, when we started the film, we didn't know where it was going to go. We didn't. We had certain ideas. Um, we didn't know that we would go into gospel as we do, and gospel's influence on funk and funk's influence on gospel. Um, we didn't know that we would go overseas to David Bowie and Elton John. Um, we knew that, you know, that if you talk about funk, you talk about the beat, you talk about house, you talk about anything, it comes back to Africa. You know, so we knew that we were going to go back to Africa with the beat, but, you know, we didn't know that it was so direct to Fela. And then, you know, at some point in researching the film, I saw Talking Heads stop making sense. And I was like, whoa, I mean, every song in Stop Making Sense is funk, you know? And I was on this panel, and David Byrne was on a panel earlier in the day. He was like at 9 o'clock in the morning, so I just went there and was like, hey, you know, would you do an interview with for a film on funk? And he said, the funk? Yeah. And so, you know, we are based in Harlem, and he rode up there on his bike and did the interview and got on his bike and rode away. But, you know, I mean, if you haven't seen the film, it's, you know, it's connected to burning down the house. He talks about that he got that from a Parliament Funkadelic show. And George Clinton talks about, you know, the song, you know, we want the funk that came from David Bowie, you know, fame, and he just said, you know, we're gonna multiply that over and over again until, you know, it's almost silly, as he calls it, like we want the funk, and just, you know, just hit. So these connections, you know, they were there, and I think they started to make sense and to give us a form for the film. But for a long time, we didn't have a form for the film. We just had different pods. We were like, okay, your brain on funk, funk and gospel, funk in England, funk in Africa, funk and hip hop, and we just would try to mix them, would throw them up on a little piece of paper and like, okay, this is a form. And finally, you know, we came to a form I think that works.
Gorgeous. Thank you. Thank you. So Sun Ra, and it's so interesting because he can be claimed by Chicago, he can be claimed by New York, he can be claimed by Toronto, he can be claimed by Saturn, and he can be claimed by Philadelphia, right? As the sort of foundational residency that he held here. I am so pleased that you included June Tyson as, I mean, yes, a collaborator, but I would even go as far as saying a thought partner, because she was choreographed, she played the flute, she was a vocalist, she designed the costumes. Like, June Tyson is erased from this Sun Ra narrative, and then you introduced us to her. So thank you so much. I was curious about if you were able to find out any other information about June Tyson and the other women involved, because it's really hard to find out who they were and sort of, yeah, their contributions.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I mean, June, if she were alive, was certainly somebody that we would have loved to have interviewed. And I did, not on camera, but I did speak with both of her daughters, both really lovely, who regaled us with, you know, stories of life on the road. Growing up, they were quite young, and I think at one point when Sun Ra was out on the West Coast, one of them came along and actually enrolled in school. They didn't know how long they were going to be out there, and so they had great stories and an unusual kind of youth, to say the least. I mean, I think one of the things about Sun Ra that makes him so singular and so unique as a performer is that he had this multimedia aesthetic, right? So it's the musicians, yes, but it's also the costume, right? It's this ritualistic performance that includes dance and poetic recitation, and often there would be videos and films that would be projected behind the orchestra. This is, really kind of ahead of its time. We see these things today, and they're all part of the show, and we're used to them. But he's doing this, a long time ago. And so, with that, there were many dancers that performed with Sun Ra Orchestra, the majority of which were women. Not all. We have some incredible footage in the film of a dancer named Raymond Sawyer. So there were men as well, but primarily there were women. And it felt really essential to include and elevate their voice and elevate, June's voice as well, because after all, when she joins the band, there's a way in which Sun Ra kind of recedes to the back almost. He's behind the piano and she takes center stage. And often he would come up and they would do sort of a duet together. But most of the time he would be on, behind the piano. And so she kind of, in many ways, became the voice of the orchestra. So we wanted to include her. And I think that when I interviewed the journalist Marcus Moore, who covers jazz for the New York Times, and he writes about hip hop and a whole bunch of things. He, really makes the argument that June Tyson is the most important member of the Sun Ra Orchestra, not named Sun Ra. But in the film, we interview Judith Holton, we interview Cheryl Banks. These are women who danced with Sun Ra for many years. And I think it's the first time that a lot of people will be hearing from the dancers. But they were really integral and a part of the show and the performance.
Thank you so much for that. And I also just thought of an interesting connection because you touch on, I'm going to say his play with gender. I'm going to talk about the importance of kind of queering an aspect of his legacy, and I don't mean sexually. I mean his non-normative approach to music, to gender, to dress, to thought, to poetry, right? Like that there's a queerness about Sun Ra that many biographers or folks talking about him or other documentaries fail to touch on, and I think is so key to his actual sound. So thank you for that. But I was also thinking about the fact that in your film he is referenced also as the mother. And then I was thinking about ballroom culture, and I'm like, wait a minute, Sun Ra had a ballroom house, right? Like the House of Ra, right? Like that's one of his selves, right? So thank you for that too. Just wanted to make that connection. Joseph, for you, I was thinking about the timing of both the films you worked on, because Summer of Soul came out, end of 2020? When did it come out?
Just summer of 2021.
Right, and so we were coming off of COVID. This is a very powerful thing to watch after the world has shifted. We've been in our homes, we have been reflecting, some of us, we've been deep in this kind of aloneness, and then we get this burst of blackness in Harlem, these images that we've never seen before. And then the other film, Sly, and the sort of burden of genius is interesting because he dies soon after. So the timing on those things, I think, were really, really important. I am curious about what it meant to sort of co-produce this film also with a DJ, what it means to kind of work with a DJ to create a film where there's sort of things that you noticed of like, oh, like I see how you're hearing this.
Amir and I have known each other for almost 30 years now, and so he has a particular way of communicating that I think like certain people get, and I happen to be one of them. So when we talked about Summer of Soul, neither of us have, he had never directed a feature or a movie before. And, I started out as a journalist, so I know his story. But we had our first conversations about Summer of Soul. We knew we wanted it to be, we wanted to make it for the theater, for theaters. We wanted it to be communal. The post-COVID timing of it, obviously COVID hit in the middle of editing the film, so we didn't know, but we'd always wanted it to be a communal experience. And so I think that really was cool, like to have it out in theaters when people are just kind of emerging out. And to see it in a theater where sort of like the screen bleeds in with the crowd and you don't really know, like it's meant to be connected like that. It just happened to, that was always intentional. But I think part of our approach to working together, and we're very collaborative and the lines kind of bleed. You know, he does some producing, I do some directing. There's a lot of trust there. But the first conversation was, I was like, how do we want this thing to feel? And we talked about Public Enemy and the Bomb Squad, and you know, that's something that was very transformative for me, very transformative for him. And we said we want this to feel like a Public Enemy album. And I think Summer of Soul reflects that kind of, like we found the perfect editor in Josh Pearson, we found the perfect cinematographer in Sean Peters, who is here somewhere, where is he? There he is. Sean changed my life, by the way. I'll tell that story later. And so, yeah, it's, you know, it's sort of like an inside-out storytelling. Like you're immersed in the story. We wanted to immerse the viewer in the story, and so the narrative is constructed that way. The film is shot that way. It's edited that way. I think Sly Lives, same thing. Yeah, it's just. I don't know what that means to feel like a Public Enemy record, but it kind of like we kind of made it that way, yeah.
No, but I think just for those of you who are not familiar with the Bomb Squad, Public Enemy, and Ice Cube's production team, is that these folks were known to use like 20 samples at once, or like within a 2-minute time. It's like you look at those liner notes, you're like, okay, this is an encyclopedia. This is you know, like you're digging through the crates, but then you're also creating one sound out of many, right? So I think that's a great way to think through how it showed up. And speaking of immersion, I am so curious about how and if you all had to develop a listening practice around the subjects or the genres. Like, how much time did you end up listening to Sun Ra and to funk and to house and to Sly and, you know, during that period?
Sure. Well, I guess it's a good time to give a shout out to my life partner, creative partner, Chester Aljournal Gordon, producer, Move Your Body. So Chester would make me playlists throughout the whole process. So I was listening to house and disco all the time. But, you know, for me, this is music that I already loved before I started making the film. So I had to like kind of delve into the Chicago side of things. We also, Vince Lawrence helped us make the score of the film along with my composer, James Newberry. So there was that listening process of like being like, okay, you want to include every single house song, but you can't. So what is it about this song that you love versus that song that you love? And how do you turn that into a motif that can develop into, you know, for me, like the score is really, really important. And I wanted it to feel as though its lead motif was Vince's maturation from being, you know, someone who's growing up in, you know, segregated Chicago to being someone who started a genre that's a $5.6 billion industry now, you know? So the music was essential to that. And yeah, I listened to more than that. I listened to funk. I listened to like gospel. I listened to anything hip hop. I listened to songs like that were house samples and hip hop samples. I listened to so much music that I feel like I listened to jazz. I listened to everything, but anything that made me feel like dancing basically became the soundtrack of my life, and remains a soundtrack and has always been the soundtrack of my life. I grew up in the club, you know. I grew up in Jersey. So I'm from Jersey City, New Jersey, and I grew up right outside of New York, so I started going to places like the Limelight and Twilo. And
Were you in Zanzibar?
I've never been to Zanzibar.
Okay.
My mom used to go to Zanzibar though.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, but yeah, so house music, you know, having a name like Elegance in the Black community is like basically like having a sign like you're gay. You know what I mean? And you're feminine. So I had to kind of like put on a certain thing in order to get just through my day-to-day life. And then when I started going out at night and going to clubs, and all of a sudden my name became a thing where people were like, oh my God, I love your name. Like, oh my God, you're so elegant. I wouldn't be like that. And the music that was playing was house music. So, you know, house music is, you know, it's not on me, it's in me, you know?
Love it. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, listening. Listening to the funk.
Yeah, I listen to a lot of funk. But I mean, I listen to a lot of music. Like from the time I wake up to the time I go to bed, I just listen to music all the time. And I guess it leaned heavily towards funk. As we were doing it, and I tried to come at different angles. Different kinds of funk, gospel funk, obscure funk. If you type in Spotify, Midwest funk, there's a playlist, or, Southern funk, and just, trying to listen to as much as possible. And then as we started to narrow it down to certain songs that we were going to use, try to figure out, what the essence of why we want to use it. So in the film, we do a thing with "I Don't Want Nobody to Give Me Nothing, Open Up the Door" by James Brown, but it's because we're talking about the one, and when at that song, it's like bam 2 3 4, bam 2 3 4, and it illustrates the one that in a way that is not confusing. It's not a confusing song. It's very obvious. So we started narrowing it down and listening to certain songs to give us certain things.
Thank you.
Sun Ra. I'm still listening to Sun Ra because for those of you who know, I mean, his output was incredibly vast, and we're still finding. This week there might be some new material that is being unearthed that we're all going to hear about. I'm sure. But the thing about Sun Ra is, and this could be intimidating for sure, but he played everything. Right? He played the blues and every stage in development of jazz, and everything out there and beyond that, nobody could even imagine at that time. So he knew he had a really wide-ranging taste. He also, he liked Disney tunes. He liked George Gershwin. He loved Rachmaninoff and Scriabin, these Russian composers. He drew on gospel. Gospel chants were like a big part of, they called them space chants, but that was a big part of what Sun Ra's did on stage. So it really ran lounge music. I mean, it really runs the gamut, but one of his favorite songs is Over the Rainbow, which is what we open the film with, obviously not written by Sun Ra. But so much of what he believed in, it's almost this cultural anthem, right, that represents a kind of hope and optimism, a vision of another world, which is so very much what Sun Ra was all about. And we had, it wasn't in the film, but we had many interpretations of that song, Over the Rainbow, that folks like Jason Moran would talk about and dissect the very colors of the rainbow and the colors of Sun Ra, Sun Ra's music, or queer interpretations of Over the Rainbow. So it was a song that he played probably over 100 times, starting in the 70s, but also just felt like a great way into the film. So, this could be a challenge, though, for an editor in particular, especially because a lot of Sun Ra's music, it's not like, you just cut on the beat and it's difficult to edit. But we knew we wanted the soundtrack, the score, to be entirely Sun Ra's music. And so, for us, we're trying to take people on that journey that he went through, that he lived through. And his concerts and his performances in and of themselves were, these journeys. But, like the catalog is I tried to do this thing where I was like, I'm going to start from the beginning. But you can't, it's not like Miles Davis where you can start here and then move forward. Because he would put out records and it would be something, you didn't know when it was recorded. It could be recorded at a time. Like many of his albums, in some ways, are like compilations that are pulling from all different time periods. And then you try and read the liner notes and figure it out. But those things we're still figuring out. So, but that was all Sun Ra.
No, but thank you for including his listening practices in your answer, because I'm like, what was that mind listening to? And I think that it was Marcus who said in the film that you probably wouldn't even be able to listen to his catalog in your lifetime.
Yeah.
I mean, that is serious.
Well, I know a couple of people who have, and yeah, as I said, that catalog is still kind of expanding, but it's a lot of music.
Right.
You know, and you know, I listen to his music all the time. There's certain things that I would gravitate at one time to another for different reasons.
Yeah.
I found that over time, I would, you know, and I think this happens probably with most Sun Ra listeners, is I would start to gravitate to the really kind of atonal stuff, to the stuff that's way out there, and then come back, because he could swing too.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think that in a way, it's just like, you never get tired of Sun Ra. There's always something there, and then, you know, he's got his, you know, his poetry and volumes of writing to all sort of
just prolific.
dig into. I do want to just say, since we're in Philadelphia and we're talking about Philadelphian musicians, that I made a film about an opera singer named Janae Bridges, who's a contemporary singer who is trying to occupy a space that we think of as largely a white and elite space. But of course, we can't fail to mention Marian Anderson, who is certainly a pioneer in the field of opera, and I think who performed across the street. And you know, she had to go overseas, right, to get a certain kind of recognition before coming back to the United States, where she would, you know, her career would blossom. And many of the folks in Sun Ra included also had to do the same.
No, thank you for that. Absolutely. And then Joseph, you're listening.
I listen to music 24/7. I actually have a room in my house that plays Sun Ra 24/7. I bought every album on Bandcamp of his recently and loaded it up in a Sonos speaker and just put it on shuffle. And it's on all day and night, which probably isn't good for my electric bill. But so I have like a dedicated Sun Ra room. I'm working on a Jay Dilla documentary right now, and thanks. And so I think listening to music for the movie you're making is interesting, because the first thing I need to do is get as much of the music as possible and then listen to it in order as much as I can, just to try to figure out the evolution of it. And then once I feel like I have a grasp on it, even though I've lived with that music before, there is a sort of intentional listening practice to it. And then once I feel like I have a grasp on that, it's almost like when you would use flashcards studying in school. I'll put everything on shuffle or just random, and then in my head while I'm listening to it is like try to like quiz myself, where is this from? And with Dilla, it's almost impossible, because there's so many beat tapes and so much of what his work that is like a secret universe of stuff that never got released, right? And so it's been sort of like flashcards for me to just like, oh, this is that beat on this mixtape, and still get it. So it's like an obsession while you're working on the material. Mm-hmm. And then I think, like Stanley said, is when you start to actually make the film, you're doing more sort of like targeted, what's the best example of this, or what's the best thing I can use for here.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I'm really big into like just obsession and immersion, which probably isn't healthy, but I feel like it's the only way to go when you're making these things.
No, I think it's healthy and necessary for the kind of documentary I want to see. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask one more question, because it's actually just so super important. I was curious about the kind of patterns that emerged when you all had to find source material and going through archives and dealing with family estates. Like, when I think about the political economy of Black music, I also know that Jason Moran refers to the industry as a plantation model. And so I'm just curious about that process for you all in sort of obtaining, you know, not just actually learning about the sort of copyright holders of Black music. I mean, who owns Black music is a whole nother discussion, but what were some of your experiences with source material and archiving, or not archiving, but sort of getting permission for the use of these things?
It was complicated. We had a wonderful music supervisor, Bonnie Greenberg. She did Sister Act and Dead Presidents, so she had a lot of relationships already in place. So for the disco side of things and the soul side of things, we were able to, like Donna Summer, her music features heavily in our film, and her universal representatives agreed to a most favored nations rate. That meant, because she was the most expensive artist, that everyone else had to accept that rate, no matter how big or small they were. I mean, they didn't have to do anything, but fortunately they did. And then for the house music, that was really complicated because you had, you know, Trax Records that is kind of like the big name label that released house music from Chicago, but you had many other kind of, you know, mom and pop operations going on. And some of these artists were selling their songs to multiple labels. And then come to find out, like I said, I thought I knew what my movie was about, and then I started making it. And come to find out Vince's father had a record label, and he owned like almost everybody's song. So Vince kind of owned a lot of people's songs, which, as you can imagine, got a little hype, you know. So there were many kind of interpersonal things going on, but in terms of like the, I guess the lesson or what's one of the things that spurred me to make the film and will continue to spur me to make movies about black artists and black musicians is like, it's just kind of heartbreaking to think that like you can start this incredible movement in music and just because of the way racism structures all human interactions in capitalism, you end up in a place where as a pioneer, you're not giving your flowers. People don't even know who you are. You don't have any money to show for it. People barely know your name, you know, and all these other people profit off of what you do, and you have to hold that and continue to make things. And I find that both inspiring and infuriating.
Anyone can answer.
It's a mess. I mean, I don't recommend making music documentaries. It's terrible. I think the two things that really I learned in making Summer of Soul and Sly Lives that really shocked me, didn't shock me, but horrified me, was how many legendary black artists publishing lives with is owned by the last person standing. Right? There's certain artists in Summer of Soul, very famous artist, who, when she passed away, the person who owns her publishing is her last manager, not her daughter. And that's terrible. And that's common. The other thing that was horrifying is in Sly Lives, we went to clear a gospel song that has been a part of the black church for decades and decades. And it's owned by two white songwriters from the 40s who took a traditional black church song and registered the publishing. So to license this song, we had to pay that publishing company. And even though we have a version of that song from before they registered it, it's crazy. And I think that the only word I can think of is something Ta-Nehisi Coates uses a lot, which is plunder. And I think that, you know, to some extent, I don't know how you change that. You know, it's also with, you know, independent music movements. It's like, it's not just a black-white issue either, right? And so I don't know how you undo that. But I feel like we've done a really, especially having Amir Questlove involved in these films so directly. We've been able to actually undo some of, like in small instances where we've asked for like certain rates because, well, Amir's a musician, like he's coming to you with this request as a musician himself. And people have actually acknowledged our request and
try that.
Yeah, and it's like, it's small, but I feel like that's the only way things will change. But I don't know how common that is or how useful that can be to everybody. But I do feel like some of those things that we're told that you have to do it a certain way, I think we have to challenge that at every turn because it's kind of gross how black music is treated in a capitalist system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was going to say the same thing, kind of jokingly, you know, don't even start a music doc. But then I felt like, you know, in reality, you know, you should make what film you want to make, and that just know what you're going in for. and like, it's a bitch. I mean, it's a mess, and so the music budget for We Want the Funk originally was $300,000. And we thought that was a lot of money, and that was not. And it depends on what film you want to do. So when we did Miles Davis, 95% of Miles's stuff was done for Columbia, which is now owned by Sony Music, and we went and sat down with them, and they gave us a great deal because they looked at it like publicity for their catalog, and they gave us a great deal. And so that's one thing. In funk, we have 30, 40 different artists, and they're all recording. It's all different, and it's just a mess. And if you want your documentary to be seen, if you want your documentary to be on television, then you've got to get the rights. And it also really depends. The question would come up with our lawyer. Okay, so how much risk are you willing? How much risk are you willing? I'm like, I don't care. Like I got a lawyer, they got a lawyer. Just so. I mean, that's the way I look at it. But so that's part of it. Most favored nation comes into it. We had our lawyer on speed dial for fair use, and our lawyer would say, okay, if you cut 5 seconds of this song, then you can use it. If you do it this way, or you fade it out and then come back, you can use it. So there's ways around it, but it's very, very complicated. But don't let that stop you. I didn't say this.
I was joking because we should keep making these, but it's really hard.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's hard.
Did you want to answer? Okay, and also you've answered to some degree in helping us think about the radical decision for Sun Ra to have his own record label, right? That's part of it. And then, I'll close this out and then open the questions here and open the panel to you all, but I just want to say there's no coincidence that Prince spent some real time walking around with the word slave on his face. There's no coincidence that Nina Simone talked about killing record company executives. It's not a coincidence that hardcore house producers who were innovators were suing Trax International, Larry Heard in particular. Like, it is no coincidence, right, that this plantation model represents what Saidiya Hartman would call the afterlife of slavery. And it is very much so about Black creative labor and white institutional wealth. So I think that what you all are doing is a part of a kind of Black musical resistance by telling our own stories, and telling the truth about who owns Black music, and in telling the stories, because the other thing about this ecosystem around Black music of white, ownership is that it's just like really, really important to think about how even the publishing industry is tied to that. So many of the people who have written biographies about jazz musicians, biographies about blues musicians, stories about the blues have been white men. And so I think changing the narrative is something that I'm grateful for you all to be doing. So thank you so much. Can we give them a round of applause? And we would love to open this up for anyone who may have a question.
We have time for about 2 questions.
Okay, sadly. 2 questions?
My question is to all of you is, what are some of the steps that an artist should take in order to own their rights to what they create?
Who said that? Over here. Okay, so there you go. Did you all hear that?
Steps that artists need to take to own what they create, right?
Nice.
Hire a great lawyer first, right? As soon as you have the idea and you're ready to go out and get money for it, hire a lawyer. And keep really good track of what you're doing. Like, I'm learning as I've gotten older the importance of archiving what I'm doing, so that there's always, I have my receipts in order. My first thing I ever did was a photo book called Bound by Night that, it did really well. It sold out. it did so well that I got a call on a Facebook message one day from a friend of mine in Paris who's like, I saw your photo in a Red Bull ad, and I had no idea. I had no clue that they did that, right? So of course I didn't have a lawyer at the time. I didn't even have a manager when I did this. I did this on the strength of the word of someone. And because I kept really good records of what I was doing in my photography, I was able to show that this work was mine, and I eventually got paid for it. So,
Did it.
yeah.
Thank you.
That's my advice.
Yeah, I mean, my advice would just be for filmmakers. I'm not sure about musicians, but film is obviously a really expensive endeavor. It can be. It requires a lot of people and a lot of tools. I would just say make things for as cheaply as possible, right? Work within your means. Use the tools that you have at your disposal, so that you don't have to borrow money, so that you don't have to go to somebody else to finance or fund your project. And that's the best way that you can keep control of the product and that you can own it. That's not going to work for every project, because some projects you really do need to go to others for. But I think that if you can figure out how to do things on your own, I mean, somebody's hat someone was walking around in a hat with the BlackStar logo, by any means necessary. So I think, the more that you can do these things on your own, the better.
Thank you. Thank you. You in the red?
Duke it out.
Is there someone with a mic? Oh, okay. Oh, someone's doing it.
I guess I have a question in regards to this conversation. I also went to the Sun Ra film and thinking about the altered state or the altered reality that he talks about. Each genre of music you speak on were, as you kind of put it, born out of our existence, by our existence within a carceral state, and is in response to that state. And I wonder if you guys find it interesting that as we talk about resistance is just us existing within a environment that forces us to kind of adapt and navigate. And once we adapt one way, the state kind of goes against it, but eventually finds a way to exploit it until something new happens. And I just felt like, do you guys kind of see how see that cycle or pattern at all?
I mean, should I respond to that? I think it's interesting because there is part of why I'm in love with Black music is that even with everything that we've discussed, plantation models, carceral state, there is a part of it that is just simply untouchable, and it's for us, and only we can feel it, and that is currency, and that is humanity, and that is dignity, that is integrity, that is innovation, right? So there is something about us that is actually untouched by harm and violence, and I think it shows up in really our artistic forms across the board, but certainly music. I think that I would love to give power to what it allows only us to feel. I think there's something in that. Because also Sun Ra talks about how he wasn't necessarily always resisting, right? What does it mean to actually just create as a human being? Is that still possible for us? And I think that he models that in a way. What do you all think? Anyway.
I think I think to me it's a bit of a game of chicken. You have a system that seems, it's like Roadrunner and Bugs Bunny, you know what I mean? You have a system that's obsessed with destroying you, and I have an insatiable will to live and to create. And for that system to destroy me, it must paint me a certain way. And every time I make something, I am dismantling that construction of who I am. So in the grand scheme of things, shit ain't sweet. It's not supposed to be. I remember when I read Native Son for the first time, and the way, I think it's Ellison, right? That's Ellison. The way there's this moment where they're talking, Richard Wright, sorry, right, Richard Wright. And the way, there was a moment where these boys around the corner talking about World War II, and how basically them farting, the smell of their farts could destroy an atom bomb. And they were laughing about it, I think I revel in the power that I have, and I'm grateful for the life and the time that I have on the earth to be able to fight the fight and to make what I make. And I'm not really concerned about what the other people are doing.
Fair enough.
I don't know. It's crazy, but I see
Well, that concludes our program. I think. No, thank you all so much.
Can I just say,
for coming up.
can I say one last
sorry.
thing,
Yeah,
not related
please.
to that question, but because we're up here. All of what we do, I mean, this is kind of preaching to the choir, but I think it's sometimes, and it sounds corny, but I'd like to say it out loud sometimes, is the arts are under assault. And I think a lot of people feel so helpless sometimes about everything that's happening. I find for me and the people that I love and hold close, one of the ways that I've found some sort of counter to that is just support and showing up and watching things and going to things and just in very small ways supporting the arts and creativity from the community that we hold. The films that you all have are tremendous achievements, and we can continue to make them even if the structure changes, as long as people show up and tell others. It's such a simple act, but it has actually a lot of resonance. And so I feel like, especially now, where every day brings like a new horror, just a very small thing that we can all do every day, and that can actually try to give us, sustain some life to this.
No, thank you so much for saying that. No, yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for these esteemed panelists, and please see their films and support them in that way as well.
Mine plays tonight. Sorry to interrupt. Mine plays tonight, so please.
Yep,
get a
tonight at
ticket.
9:30.
Yes, I think so. It's tonight on the website, but please watch it. Thank you.
All right, thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.